My family treated me like an outsider my whole life and wanted to give me up for adoption. Then they got mad when I refused to share my grandparents' inheritance. I'm Caleb, 28M, and my parents, especially my mom, have consistently shown favoritism towards my older sister Laurel, 30F, for as long as I can remember. I never understood why, but it's been a constant source of pain and frustration throughout my life. When I was born, my parents were struggling financially and emotionally. My dad had just lost his job at a local factory, and they were barely making ends meet with my mom's part-time job at a diner. My mom had severe postpartum depression after Laurel's birth, and when I came along just 2 years later, they felt overwhelmed. They made the decision to send me to live with my grandparents when I was just a few months old. I stayed with my grandparents until I was 7 years old. My grandparents lived in a small town about an hour away from my parents. They had a cozy 2-story house with a big backyard where I spent most of my childhood. My grandfather was a retired high school teacher, and my grandmother was a homemaker. They were patient, kind, and always had time for me. During those early years, I had no idea that my grandparents weren't my real parents. They provided me with a loving and nurturing environment, and I felt happy and secure. I remember spending hours in the backyard, helping my grandfather tend to his vegetable garden. He taught me about different plants and how to care for them. My grandmother would often bake cookies with me, letting me mix the dough and shape the cookies. These simple moments filled my early childhood with joy and a sense of belonging. However, as I grew older, things began to change. My parents would visit occasionally, explaining that they were my real parents and that my stay with my grandparents was only temporary. These visits were always confusing and emotionally draining for me. I didn't understand why these strangers were claiming to be my parents when I already had loving ones in my grandparents. I remember one particular visit when I was about 5 years old. My parents brought Laurel along, and I was excited to play with her. But Laurel seemed disinterested and clung to our mom the whole time. When I tried to show her my favorite toys, she knocked them out of my hands and started crying. Our mom immediately comforted her, shooting me a disapproving look as if I had done something wrong. That was one of the first times I felt the sting of favoritism, even though I couldn't fully understand it at the time. When I turned 7, my parents brought me back to live with them. I was excited at first, thinking I'd finally be part of a normal family. But reality quickly set in, and I realized how different life was going to be. My sister Laurel had always been the center of attention, and that didn't change when I arrived. One of the first things I noticed was that Laurel had her own room, while I had to sleep in a small converted storage space. It was barely big enough for a bed and a small desk. The walls were bare and there was only one tiny window near the ceiling. My parents said it was because Laurel needed her privacy as a growing girl, but it felt like another sign that I wasn't as important. Whenever I tried to decorate my tiny room or make it feel more like home, Laurel would complain about the noise or the smell of paint. My parents always sided with her. School was another area where the favoritism was glaringly obvious. When Laurel got good grades, my parents would throw small parties and shower her with gifts. I remember one time when Laurel got an A on a difficult math test. Our parents took her out for ice cream and bought her a new bike. When I brought home straight A's on my report card a few weeks later, I was lucky to get a pat on the back. They'd often say things like, "Well, of course you did well, you had all that extra help from your grandparents." It felt like they were diminishing my achievements. Extracurricular activities were no different. Laurel was into dance and theater, and my parents never missed a single performance. They'd sit in the front row, beaming with pride, often with bouquets of flowers ready to present to her after the show. When I joined the debate team in middle school, I was thrilled. I worked hard and made it to the state finals in my first year. I was so excited to show my parents what I could do, but neither of them showed up. Their excuse? They had already committed to attending one of Laurel's dance recitals that day. I remember standing on the stage, scanning the audience, hoping to see their faces, but they weren't there. My grandparents came instead, cheering louder than anyone else in the auditorium. As we grew older, the favoritism became even more pronounced. When Laurel graduated high school, our parents threw a massive party. They rented out a local community center, invited all our relatives and Laurel's friends, and even hired a DJ. The highlight of the party was when they presented Laurel with a brand new car, a shiny red convertible with a big bow on it. For my graduation 2 years later, I got a watch and a small family dinner at a local restaurant. When I mentioned feeling hurt by the difference in celebration, my mom brushed it off, saying, "Well, Laurel is the oldest. It's different for the first child." When it came time for college, the disparity in treatment reached new heights. Laurel got into her dream school, a prestigious private university known for its performing arts program. It was expensive, way beyond what our family could comfortably afford. But my parents were determined to make it happen. They took out loans, dipped into their retirement savings, and even asked relatives to chip in. They said no sacrifice was too great for Laurel's future. When it was my turn to apply for colleges, I had worked hard and gotten into a good state university with a partial scholarship. I was proud of my achievement and excited about the prospect of studying business. But when I asked my parents about financial support, they told me I'd have to figure out my own funding because they had already spent so much on education. They suggested I take out student loans or look for more scholarships. It was a harsh reality check that made me feel like my education and future were less valuable to them than laurels. Throughout all of this, my grandparents remained my strongest supporters. They attended every event they could, celebrated my achievements, and always made me feel loved and valued. They often tried to speak to my parents about their treatment of me, but it never seemed to make a difference. My mom would usually dismiss their concerns, saying they were overreacting or that they didn't understand the challenges of raising two children. Now, fast forward to the present. Despite the lack of support from my parents, I've managed to build a successful career. I graduated from college with honors, working part-time jobs to support myself through school. After graduation, I landed a job at a growing tech startup. Through hard work and determination, I've worked my way up to a management position. I'm proud of what I've accomplished, even if my parents don't seem to fully appreciate it. I'm engaged to an amazing woman, Rachel, 27F, who understands my family dynamics and has been incredibly supportive. We met at a local charity event 3 years ago and hit it off immediately. Rachel comes from a close-knit family and was shocked when she first witnessed how my parents treated me. She's been my rock, encouraging me to stand up for myself and reminding me of my worth when family interactions leave me feeling down. We're planning our wedding for next summer, and I'm excited to start this new chapter of my life with her. My grandparents recently informed me that they've decided to leave their entire inheritance to me. They explained that they've been watching how my parents have treated me over the years, and they feel that I'll need the financial support more than Laurel, given the lack of support I've received from my parents. They also mentioned that they trust I'll take care of them in their old age if needed, as I've always been close to them. When my parents found out about this, they were furious. They're demanding that I split the inheritance with Laurel, claiming it's only fair. They argue that Laurel has always been an integral part of the family and deserves an equal share. They've even gone as far as to threaten not to attend my wedding if I don't agree to their demands. My mom called me selfish and ungrateful, saying I was tearing the family apart over money. Laurel has also gotten involved, sending me angry text messages accusing me of manipulating our grandparents. She claims that I've always been jealous of her and that this is my way of getting back at her and our parents. It's frustrating because I've never done anything to harm Laurel, I've only ever wanted to be treated equally. I'm torn about what to do. On one hand, I feel like this inheritance is a form of justice for all the years of favoritism I've endured. It's not just about the money, but about finally feeling valued and prioritized by someone in my family. On the other hand, I don't want to cause a permanent rift in the family. Despite everything, they're still my family, and the thought of losing them completely is scary. Rachel thinks I should stand my ground. She argues that my parents and Laurel have never considered my feelings, so why should I prioritize theirs now? She believes that accepting the inheritance as my grandparents intended would be a way of honoring their wishes and the love they've shown me throughout my life. But I'm worried about the long-term consequences. What if this decision leads to me being completely cut off from my family? What if they make my grandparents' last years difficult by creating drama over this decision? And part of me wonders if sharing the inheritance would finally make my parents and Laurel see me as an equal member of the family. I'm at a loss and could really use some outside perspective. Am I wrong for wanting to keep the entire inheritance? Should I give in to my parents' demands for the sake of family peace? Or should I honor my grandparents' wishes and accept that this might mean the end of my relationship with my parents and sister? Any advice would be greatly appreciated. Update 1. Thank you all for your supportive comments and advice. I've taken some time to reflect on the situation and have some updates to share. After my last post, I decided to have a serious conversation with my parents about the inheritance and our relationship in general. I invited them over to my place, thinking a neutral ground might help keep things civil. I spent days preparing what I wanted to say, even writing down key points so I wouldn't get flustered or forget anything important. The day of the meeting arrived, and I was a bundle of nerves. Rachel gave me a reassuring hug before my parents arrived, reminding me that I had nothing to be ashamed of and that my feelings were valid. When the doorbell rang, I took a deep breath and opened the door. The moment they stepped inside, I could feel the tension in the air. My mom's lips were pressed into a thin line, and my dad looked uncomfortable, his eyes darting around the room as if looking for an escape. I invited them to sit down in the living room, offering them something to drink, which they declined. I started the conversation by expressing my desire to have an open and honest discussion about our family dynamics and the recent inheritance issue. I barely got 3 sentences in before my mom interrupted me. She launched into a tirade about how selfish and ungrateful I was being. Her voice rose as she spoke, her face flushing with anger. She brought up how they had sacrificed so much for me by letting me live with my grandparents during my early years. According to her, this was a selfless act to ensure I had a stable environment, not because they couldn't handle having 2 young children. She painted a picture of them struggling to make ends meet but still making the difficult decision to send me to my grandparents for my own good. My dad mostly stayed quiet during this, occasionally nodding in agreement with my mom. His silence was familiar. He had always been passive in family conflicts, usually deferring to my mom's opinions and decisions. When I finally got a chance to speak, I tried to explain how their favoritism had affected me over the years. I brought up specific instances, the differences in our graduation celebrations, the disparity in support for our educations, the countless times Laurel's needs and wants were prioritized over mine. As I spoke, I could feel years of pent-up hurt and frustration pouring out. But they dismissed my feelings entirely. My mom went as far as to say that I was imagining things and that they had always treated Laurel and me equally. She accused me of being overly sensitive and reading too much into normal sibling dynamics. It was like she was rewriting our entire family history, creating a narrative where they had been perfect, loving parents to both their children. The conversation took an unexpected turn when I mentioned how they had funded Laurel's college education but left me to fend for myself. I thought this was a clear-cut example of their favoritism, one they couldn't possibly deny. But my mom's response shocked me to my core. She blurted out that the reason they hadn't helped me was that they had always viewed me as my grandparents' responsibility, not theirs. Her exact words were, "We only took you back when you were 7 because your grandparents insisted it was time for you to be with your real family. But in our hearts, you were always their child more than ours." I was stunned into silence. All these years, I had thought that living with my grandparents was a temporary solution to my parents' initial struggles. I had believed that deep down, they had always considered me their son, even if they didn't always show it. Finding out that they had essentially given me away and never really considered me their responsibility was devastating. The argument escalated from there. My parents demanded again that I split the inheritance with Laurel, arguing that she deserved it more because she had been a real part of the family all along. When I refused, my dad finally spoke up, threatening to contest the will when the time came. He mentioned getting lawyers involved, saying they wouldn't let me steal from Laurel. At this point, Rachel, who had been listening from the other room, we had agreed she would give us privacy but stay nearby in case things got out of hand, came in and asked my parents to leave. She could see how upset I was getting and felt things were getting out of hand. My parents left in a huff, with my mom declaring that I was no longer welcome in their home unless I agreed to their demands. After they left, I broke down. The realization that my parents had never truly considered me their child hit me hard. It explained so much, why I had always felt like an outsider, why their love always seemed conditional. Rachel held me as I cried, assuring me that I had done nothing wrong and that I deserved better. The next day, I received a barrage of text messages from Laurel. Apparently, our parents had told her about the inheritance and my refusal to share it. Her messages were a mix of guilt-tripping and threats. She accused me of tearing the family apart and warned that if I didn't agree to split the inheritance, she would make sure I regretted it. Some of her messages were particularly hurtful. She wrote things like, "You were always jealous of me, and now you're trying to punish me for being the better child, and mom and dad should have left you with grandma and grandpa for good. You've never been a real part of this family anyway." I haven't responded to any of her messages. I'm feeling overwhelmed and unsure of how to proceed. On one hand, I feel more certain than ever that I deserve this inheritance. It's not just about the money, it's about finally having someone in my family prioritize me and my needs. On the other hand, the idea of losing my entire family over this is terrifying. Despite everything, they're the only family I have, and the thought of being completely alone is daunting. I've scheduled a meeting with my grandparents to discuss the situation. I want to make sure they understand the chaos their decision has caused and see if they have any advice. They've always been my strongest supporters, and I trust their judgment more than anyone else's. I'm also considering seeking legal advice to understand my rights and options, especially given my dad's threat to contest the will. I want to be prepared for any potential legal battles that might arise from this situation. For now, Rachel and I have decided to put our wedding plans on hold. We feel it's best to sort out this family drama before we take that big step. The idea of walking down the aisle without my family there, or worse, with them attending but resenting me, is not how I want to start our married life. Rachel has been incredibly understanding and supportive through all of this. She keeps reminding me that we're a team and that whatever decision I make, she'll stand by me. I'm also considering therapy to help me process all of this. The revelation about my parents never truly considering me their child has reopened a lot of old wounds, and I'm struggling to cope with the emotions it's bringing up. I'll update again after I've spoken with my grandparents and possibly a lawyer. Thank you all again for your support and advice. It means more than you know to have people validate my feelings and experiences after years of being gaslighted by my own family. Update 2. It's been a few weeks since my last update, and I wanted to share some developments in the situation. I met with my grandparents as planned to discuss the inheritance situation and the fallout with my parents and sister. It was an emotional and eye-opening conversation that lasted several hours. We met at their house, the same one where I spent my early years. Being there brought back a flood of happy memories, which made the current situation feel even more painful in contrast. My grandmother had baked my favorite cookies, just like she used to when I was a kid, and the familiar smell filled the house. As we sat in their cozy living room, surrounded by photos of our family through the years, my grandparents listened attentively as I recounted my recent confrontation with my parents and the subsequent messages from Laurel. They were visibly upset to hear about how my parents had reacted, but they weren't entirely surprised. Then, they revealed some information about my early years that I had never known before. My grandfather, his voice steady but filled with emotion, began to explain. Apparently, when I was born, My parents had initially considered putting me up for adoption. They felt overwhelmed with Laurel, who was only 2 at the time, and weren't prepared for another child. My grandfather's eyes welled up with tears as he recounted how they had received a phone call late one night from my sobbing mother, saying she couldn't handle another baby and was thinking of giving me away. My grandparents, horrified at the thought of losing their grandson to strangers, stepped in and offered to raise me themselves. They had hoped that my parents would eventually want to be more involved in my life, which is why they encouraged them to take me back when I was 7. This revelation hit me hard. It explained so much about why I had always felt like an outsider in my own family. My grandparents apologized for not telling me sooner, saying they had hoped my parents would have stepped up and been better parents to me over time. They also reaffirmed their decision about the inheritance. My grandmother took my hand and explained that it wasn't just about making up for the lack of support I'd received from my parents, but also because they truly believed I would use the money responsibly and be there for them in their old age if needed. They expressed disappointment in how Laurel had turned out, mentioning that she often ignored their calls and rarely visited unless she needed something. My grandfather added that they had always seen the potential in me, even when my parents couldn't. He reminded me of all the times I had helped him in the garden, how quickly I had learned to read, and how I always tried to solve problems instead of avoiding them. "You've got a good head on your shoulders, Caleb," he said, "and a kind heart. We know you'll do right by this inheritance." After this conversation, I felt a strange mix of sadness and relief. Sadness for the family relationship I had always longed for but never truly had, and relief at finally understanding why things had always been the way they were. Following my grandparents' advice, I consulted with a lawyer about the inheritance situation. The lawyer, a kind-faced woman named Mrs. Torres, listened carefully to my story and reviewed the documents my grandparents had provided. She assured me that as long as my grandparents were of sound mind when making their will, it would be very difficult for my parents or Laurel to successfully contest it. However, she advised documenting any threats or harassment from my family members, just in case. She also suggested that my grandparents might want to include a letter of intent with their will, explaining their reasons for their decision, which could help deter any legal challenges. With this information, I've made some decisions. I'm going to respect my grandparents' wishes and accept the inheritance when the time comes. I won't be sharing it with Laurel. I've decided to go no contact with my parents and Laurel, at least for now. I've blocked their numbers and social media accounts. The constant guilt-tripping and threats were taking a toll on my mental health. Rachel and I have decided to move forward with our wedding plans, but we're opting for a small, intimate ceremony rather than the larger event we had initially planned. We'll be inviting my grandparents and close friends only. These decisions weren't easy to make, but I feel like they're necessary for my well-being and my future. The therapist has been helping me understand that it's okay to prioritize my own happiness and mental health, even if it means distancing myself from toxic family members. Rachel has been my rock through all of this. She's been patient when I've needed to talk things through for hours, and she's given me space when I've needed time alone to process. Her unwavering support has made me even more certain that she's the person I want to spend my life with. As for the wedding, we're planning a small ceremony in a local botanical garden. It's where Rachel and I had our first date, so it holds special meaning for us. My grandparents are thrilled to be involved, with my grandfather offering to walk me down the aisle and my grandmother helping with the flower arrangements. I know these decisions might seem harsh to some, but I feel like I need to prioritize my own well-being and future. I'm tired of feeling like I have to earn my place in a family that never really wanted me. Thank you all for your support through this difficult time. I'll update again if there are any significant developments. Update 3, it's been a few months since my last update, and a lot has happened. I wanted to share some final developments in this situation. First, Rachel and I got married in a small, beautiful ceremony last month. It was everything we hoped it would be, intimate, joyful, and filled with love. The botanical garden was in full bloom, providing a gorgeous backdrop for our vows. My grandparents were there, beaming with pride. My grandfather did indeed walk me down the aisle, and I'll never forget the moment he squeezed my arm and whispered, "We're so proud of you, son." My grandmother had outdone herself with the flowers, creating stunning arrangements that perfectly complemented the natural beauty of the garden. We had about 30 guests, close friends and a few family members from Rachel's side. The absence of my parents and Laurel was noticeable, but not in a negative way. If anything, it reinforced that we had made the right decision. The day was filled with genuine laughter, heartfelt toasts, and a palpable sense of celebration. It felt like a new beginning, surrounded by people who truly cared for us. About a week after the wedding, I received a letter from my parents. The envelope sat on our kitchen counter for 2 days before I found the courage to open it. With Rachel by my side, offering silent support, I finally read its contents. The letter was unexpected, to say the least. My parents apologized for their behavior and treatment of me over the years. They admitted that they had always struggled to connect with me and had unfairly placed the burden of that struggle on me rather than examining their own actions. My mother wrote about her postpartum depression after my birth, acknowledging that it had affected her ability to bond with me but recognizing that it wasn't an excuse for years of emotional neglect. They explained that my grandparents had confronted them after our last meeting, laying out in no uncertain terms how their favoritism and neglect had affected me. This, combined with the reality of missing their son's wedding, had forced them to reevaluate their behavior. While the apology seemed sincere, they still expressed hope that I would reconsider sharing the inheritance with Laurel. This showed me that while they might regret their past actions, they still didn't fully understand the depth of the issue. After much consideration and discussion with Rachel and my therapist, I decided to respond with a letter of my own. I thanked them for their apology and acknowledged the difficulty they must have faced in writing it. I explained that while I appreciated their words, I needed time to process everything that had happened. Years of hurt and resentment couldn't be erased with a single letter, no matter how heartfelt. I made it clear that I wasn't ready to resume contact and that my decision about the inheritance was final. I also suggested that they seek family therapy to work through their own issues, especially concerning their relationship with Laurel and their understanding of fairness and equality in parenting. Speaking of Laurel, she reached out via email shortly after I received the letter from my parents. Her message was less apologetic and more accusatory. She claimed that our parents' apology to me had caused a rift between her and them, and she blamed me for destroying the family. She wrote about feeling betrayed by our parents' admission of favoritism and demanded to know what I had said to them to turn them against her. I chose not to respond to her email, feeling that any response would only fuel further conflict. On a more positive note, my relationship with my grandparents has grown even stronger. They've been incredibly supportive throughout this whole ordeal. We have weekly dinners together, and I'm helping them navigate some health issues they've been experiencing. My grandfather was recently diagnosed with early-stage Parkinson's disease, and I've been accompanying him to doctor's appointments and helping research treatment options. It feels good to be able to care for them the way they cared for me. Rachel and I are doing well. We're settling into married life and talking about starting a family of our own soon. The whole experience has made me even more determined to be a better parent than mine were, to create the kind of loving, supportive family environment I always wished I had. Rachel and I have had many discussions about parenting styles and family dynamics, determined to learn from the mistakes of the past. As for the inheritance, my grandparents are thankfully still in good health, so that's not an immediate concern. When the time comes, I plan to use it responsibly, possibly setting up a trust for our future children's education. I've also considered using part of it to start a scholarship fund for students who, like me, had to put themselves through college without family support. I'm still attending therapy, which has been incredibly helpful in processing my feelings and working through the trauma of my childhood. It's a journey, but I'm making progress. I'm learning to set healthy boundaries, to validate my own feelings, and to build self-esteem that doesn't rely on my parents' approval. In the end, while this situation brought a lot of pain and difficult truths to light, it also led to clarity and a chance for a fresh start. I'm focusing on the family I've chosen, Rachel, my grandparents, and our close friends, and looking forward to the future. I've learned that family isn't just about blood relations, but about the people who support you, love you unconditionally, and bring out the best in you.